Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just 1 minute. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our online program at Mechanics Institute in San Francisco. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and today I'm very pleased to bring together author Selby Wynn Schwartz, who's joining us from Paris, in conversation with Professor Loretta Stec from San Francisco State University, to be in conversation about Selby's new book, After Sappho. In her new book, fragments of Sappho's life and her poetry imagined give way to reflection and inspiration for the lives of women through the ages. They profess their agency, they give their voice, they redefine their lives and their livelihoods. Now, for those of you who are new to the Mechanics Institute, we were founded in 1854, and we're one of San Francisco's most vital literary and cultural centers in the heart of the city. We feature our general interest library, an international chess club, and ongoing author and literary events throughout the year. And on Friday nights, our Cinema Lit film series. So please visit our website at milibrary.org. And by the way, we have programs online and also in person. If you're here in San Francisco, please join us for a free tour of Mechanics Institute on Wednesday at noon. So I'd like to introduce our guests. Selby Wynn Schwartz holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of Bodies of Others, Drag Dances, and Their Afterlives. And she's a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and also has a new novella, A Life of Chameleons. And Loretta Stec is professor in the English department at San Francisco State University, where she teaches courses on modernist literature with a focus on women writers, animal studies and literature, Southern African literature in English, and literature of exile and migration. One of her favorite courses is to teach an intensive study of Virginia Woolf's works, and she's published articles on Woolf, as well as Gertrude Stein, Juna Barnes, D.H. Lawrence, Bessie Head, and other 20th century writers. So I'm very pleased to welcome both of our guests, Selby Wynn Schwartz and Loretta Stec. Also, after our conversation, we'll engage you, our audience, in a Q&A, so please put your questions in the Q&A or chat. So please welcome Loretta Stec and Selby Wynn Schwartz.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you to all the guests who are here, who we can't see, but we know you're there, and we're delighted that you are with us. And I am very much delighted and honored to be here with Selby Wynn Schwartz to talk about her wonderful book, After Sappho. After Sappho is a beautifully constructed lyrical meditation on creative women who have loved other women during the modernist period, from the late 19th century through the 1920s. These women attempt to break free of the limitations of gender in myriad ways, and for many, their guiding light was Sappho, the ancient Greek poet whose work has survived only in fragments. Selby weaves Sappho's poetic fragments, translated by Anne Carson, throughout the vignettes of women's lives, from Italy, England, the United States, France, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. and she gives us a riveting and lyrical account of often forgotten histories. Anne Carson says in her introduction to her translation of Sappho that she tries to translate in a way to allow the reader, quote, a free space of imaginal adventure. And I kept thinking about this phrase. This phrase was echoing in my mind as I was rereading Selby's wonderful book, and I enjoyed it even more the second time. So I was delighted to do so. Selby's fragmented narrative presents writers and artists who may be familiar to many of us, such as Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Natalie Barney, Colette, Isadora Duncan, Sarah Bernhardt, and Vita Sackville-West, but also includes figures who are less well known, including Lina Poletti from Italy, the Irish designer and architect Eileen Gray, and Anna Kuliskioff from the Ukraine. In After Sappho, Selby interweaves the biographical facts and words of many of these women in short titled sections that allow the free space of imaginal adventure to the reader, allowing us to fill in the historical record with the astonishing personal and collective narratives of women artists, activists, lesbians, and saphists who imagined new identities in the modernist era. So we're just going to have a little conversation. I'll ask a few questions, ask Selby to read a couple of passages for us, and then we will take your questions in, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, the audience questions. I just wanted to call attention to the fact that in addition to this book being beautiful and lyrical, it illustrates great erudition. The bibliographic note to the novel is 17 pages long. And Selby, I wondered if you would speak a little bit about your study of languages. The research for this book required you to know Italian, Greek, French, English, obviously, and perhaps other languages as well. And you also have a PhD in comparative literature. So I wondered if you might talk about your study of languages, your study of comparative literature, and how this book arrived out of that study, or whether you were inspired in some completely different way to write this.
Well, thank you for this extremely generous introduction, and I'm delighted and honored to be here and to be in conversation with you. And I think I can say that this book is very much a product of my time studying comparative literature. You mentioned that it's got a very long bibliographic note, and as you know, when we're trained as graduate students in comparative literature, I think we're taught ethically to acknowledge the debts that we have to scholars and to archivists and to thinkers who've come before us. And you know, among my many debts to people who come before me, I think a lot about the feminist writer Sarah Ahmed, who says that citations can be feminist bricks. So they're ways of building lineages of thinking, and they're how we arrived at the places we arrive at in our own writing and thinking. And so I feel I try to do that as well, even though it's not very conventional for a novel to have such a long bibliography. But I think in particular comparative literature, you know, is a kind of it's kind of place where they put people who want to do too many things at once. And so I'm one of those people, and I maybe have never really gotten over that. And I not only loved being able to do many things at once at that time, but I was also doing different things than I'm doing now. I didn't study modernist literature at that time. I was a medievalist, actually. And so I did study Italian, but I also was reading a lot of, you know, medieval poetry in Old Occitan and Galego Portuguese and things like that, and studying a lot of poems by and about women, or that were performed itinerantly in parts of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. So I was still interested in women, in gender, in performance, in poetry, but in a quite different time. But I think even though those studies were so different, at the same time, you know, that I was studying these medieval languages, you know, somebody in my department was gathering all of the Arabic epithets for lions at that time. And someone else was studying the history of Cuban radio. And so I think I retained not only my own peculiar curiosities, but also the sense of being enriched by touching other fields and what other people are learning. And so this book very much comes not only from what I was allowed and encouraged to do in graduate school with that kind of curiosity, but also that I think the whole field allows you to follow these somewhat errant paths into your own curiosity, into the deepest reaches of whatever your research brings you, and also into these outermost branches where you can't know what you'll learn.
Well, you bring together many of the fruits of your curiosity in a very impressive way. So your erudition is very evident in this volume, even though it's, not an academic work per se. It's a very pleasurable work to read. So let me pick up on what you just said about Sarah Ahmed. I mean, the idea of creating citations only of women critics and theorists and writers is part of her methodology. And I would connect her back to Virginia Woolf and the idea of thinking back through our mothers, if we are women, that she talks about in A Room of One's Own. And I see After Sappho very much in that vein as well, in that lineage. You say, in After Sappho, our lives are the missing lines from the fragments of Sappho's poems. Women's lives, and particularly the lives of women who desire women, lesbian, queer, activist women, are often ignored in traditional history and biography. And so your work is in part to build that lineage, to create that set of connections that are often obscured. So I wondered if I might ask you to read on page 43 in the American edition, the short passage called Sappho Fragment 16. And this will give us a sense of how you handle, some of the material about women's lives, but also the sort of tone that you set and the kind of style that you create for this wonderful book.
I would be happy to read, yes. So yes, this is Sappho Fragment 16. Whenever we could leave these marriages, we fled. Those of us who had nothing in our pockets but our own badly stitched handkerchiefs scraped together what we could. Some of us gave piano lessons on dull afternoons, and others dusted the parlors of ladies until we could buy our passage. There were those like William Seymour, industrious lads in the trousers of their brothers, and there were those who might have idled their lives away on estates had they wished. But none of us wished to live overmastered. Always, however we left the verb impadronirsi, we went with no return. Thus we embarked, each in her own way, on the voyage out. We arrived in unknown cities, in the ports of southern islands, at the houses of anyone appearing to be a sister. We shuddered and threw off our names. We began to find each other, slowly at first, because we were so new. You would see someone in the street, someone like X, and wonder and know at the same time. Or there would be a glance like ours, wondering and knowing, rising to meet you on the balcony where you were standing because it was the farthest limit of your father's house. Then we would write our first uncertain letters to each other, hesitant to ask, to tell, with what words, stretched over silences. We took a little false courage in seeing our lines torn and gasping on the page like Sappho's, to pray for a share towards out of the unexpected. Afterwards, we sat very still, waiting for a response, hoping for a correspondence of fragments.
Just lovely. Thank you so much for that. This passage, begins with this idea that whenever we could leave these marriages, we fled, right? And the book includes a lot of material about patriarchal violence, right? And the history of the horrible things that were done to women. And also the book includes information about various laws and structures that oppressed women, right? So it's not simply individual men, but structures as well. And one example is Article 544 of the Penal Code of Italy that transferred women who were raped to their attackers as brides. And to my astonishment, that penal code article was not repealed until 1981. I learned from you.
I am sorry to say, yes, that is true.
Quite shocking. And I was thinking as I was reading these kinds of passages, how difficult the task was that you set for yourself, because you were trying to reveal this history of violence, but you were also writing a book that is very lyrical, very imagistic, very, full of poetry. And I wondered if you would like to speak to that challenge of bringing those two realms together and what that meant for you as a writer.
Yes, well, I do think, I suppose it does make me feel at the same time both furious and in a way like full of a poetic longing for something that is not that. Like it fills me with a longing to imagine that it could be otherwise, other than histories of cis heteropatriarchy, as you said, not so much individual, but really systems and structures of violence and oppression. And so I think perhaps it comes from that kind of desire to imagine otherwise, and to be enraged in a way that is not just confined to a sort of internal burning with rage, but also seeks to imagine beyond, to create other visions of how things could be, and maybe also has some sarcasm in it. Like some of these things are patently and darkly absurd. It is absurd. It is insane and absurd that anyone could say to themselves, do you know what? I think half of the people are not really equal to the other half of the people just because they were born that way. And that's, I mean, when you say that out loud, whether that's about gender, whether that's about race, whether that's about any of these other identity categories, it's clearly an insane thing to think. So there's that kind of, I think it provokes a kind of sarcasm like that is also perhaps both furious and maybe has a kind of wit that comes with it, because if you can poke at the absurdity of that kind of statement, then something comes out of it that must not be that, it must be something else. So I think, my aim in taking, I did take almost all of the men out of this time, out of this history. Oh, Oscar Wilde is there, and Ibsen as well has stayed in, but I did, and it wasn't to essentialize in some way the category of women. And, these are people who at the time identified as women, and we don't know how they would identify now. We have different words than they had, and different categories for identities. But without, essentializing that category, or without saying in some way, oh, that category must be better than other categories, which is just the reverse of what was done, to women. I wanted to try imaginatively to sort of to push what had been always at the center, always canonical, always honored, always cherished in the archive, to just push it out of the center for a minute, so that some of these characters, I thought of it as like having a minute to think for yourself, and having those thoughts and those feelings and those forms of creative work just take up the center for a bit. It doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't have to be better than everything else. Just to have a little interlude, really, where we could imagine what that would be like. And in that way, I feel, very indebted to Elena Ferrante, who talks a lot about this this form of imagining that is gendered. Again, without trying, without essentializing or recategorizing people in ways that limit them as well.
Great, thank you. I think it works. I mean, I think your project to do that works very well. And I was very interested in how many reviewers remark on the fact that the men are absent. And some of them seem to be perfectly fine with it, and others seem to be a little puzzled, like, where are the men? which I don't really understand since they're everywhere else.
Everywhere else. There are so many. I mean, the first one I took out, and this is because I have a chip on my shoulder about Gabriele D'Annunzio, who's just constantly striding across literary and military history. He was a proto-fascist. He's got enough history written about him, in my opinion, and he existed in time. We can read about him, but I just didn't want to be another person writing more things about Gabriele D'Annunzio. So once I took him out, I could see
Very
if
good.
just really take him out.
Well, it's refreshing. It's very
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think when you were talking about creating something alternate, right? Thinking about what could be other than this history of patriarchy and sexist absurdity. You really use Sappho well to help you do that, right? Like that realm of the sapphic imagination becomes really crucial to that alternate realm. And I think, one of the things that I noticed more in the second reading of this book is how well you structured it. And one of the ways that you create a structure is by repeating images across the text in very modernist fashion. So the book moves back and forth in time, right? We kind of start in the 1890s, early 1890s. The book ends in 1928. But meanwhile, the sections go back and forth in time. And so it has a sweep of the modernist period, but we're not strictly chronological. So part of what structures the book instead of chronology is this series of images. And those, of course, are very connected to Sappho and her method and her poetic style. So I wondered if you might read one more passage for us, which is early in the book. It's on our page 14 in the American edition. It's titled Sappho Fragment 2.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
So this is Sappho Fragment 2. A clotted poem is a calling, both a hymn and a plea. It bends in obeisance to the divine, ever dappled and shining, and at the same time, it calls out to ask, when will you arrive? Why is your radiance distant from my eyes? You drop through the branches when I sleep at the roots. You pour yourself out like the light of an afternoon, and yet somewhere you linger, outside the day. It is while invoking the one who abides and yet must be called urgently from a great distance that Sappho writes of Aithusomenon, the bright trembling of leaves in the moment of anticipation. A poet is always living in clotted time, whatever her century. She is calling out. She is waiting. She lies down in the shade of the future and drowses among its roots. Her case is the genitive of remembering.
Thank you so much. That image of the trembling of leaves appears numerous times in different contexts throughout the book, and it's a very beautiful image, and it has many different meanings. And I wondered if you would like to speak a little bit about either that image or how you chose the images that you chose to hold the book together, and particularly something I know very little about, the connections to the Greek grammar that you're making.
Yeah, I'd be glad to because this allows me to talk about Anne Carson, which I'm a kind of an Anne Carson addict, I think it's fair to say. So I should say, so among the, I have studied various Romance and Germanic languages, but I've never studied Greek. So I actually entirely almost depend on other people to understand, how cases work in Greek, how grammar works in Greek. And that's been fascinating me to sort of, to be such an amateur and apprentice in this. And I feel lucky to be to kind of sit at the feet of Anne Carson in this way, she's both a poet, or she is a poet, as well as a translator, as well as a scholar, as well as someone who reads a lot of Virginia Woolf herself. So I think this image, of how to translate this word, I'm entirely indebted to her for the beauty of that language. And she's, I hope, indebted to Sappho for that as well, how to to convey this kind of movement that is not a movement that is caused by physical force, but rather by some kind of infusion of light or some kind of enigma of time. And maybe that goes back to what you said about the book that I wrote doesn't really operate on straight time. It operates in these kind of ellipses or circles that gradually do move forward over time, but not in a straight way, not in a straightforward way, linear or temporal. But I was also thinking, about this passage. So when I was quite young, I started reading Virginia Woolf, and I think I'm still very much under the spell of that. And that image, when you reminded me, made me think, I just admit this, of my favorite line into The Lighthouse, which I will read you, and then you'll see how indebted I am doubly to both of them. So this is Virginia Woolf from To the Lighthouse. It says, it's about Mrs. Ramsay. It could not last, she knew, but at the moment her eyes were so clear that they seemed to go round the table, unveiling each of these people and their thoughts and their feelings without effort, like a light stealing under water, so that its ripples and the reeds in it and the minnows balancing themselves and the sudden silent trout are all lit up, hanging, trembling. So I feel like it's so obvious that I just, I never got over that, maybe just that line. And then when Anne Carson came along, it was really a lost cause on my part. And so I think that's what makes that image for me is remaining under the spell of maybe of only that line.
Well, that's beautiful. And it gets at the idea that this image has so many resonances, right? It indicates that mystical experience as well as, just a physical trembling, it's sexual desire. It's, many things throughout the book. So I think you do very beautiful things with that image. So
Thank you.
You take it beyond your mentors, your literary mentors.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
I don't know. Did you want to say anything more about the other images you chose, or should we go on to darker material?
Yeah, well, we could go on to darker material, but I guess I should say, because I did refragment the fragments of Sappho, and that was a choice, and maybe that's questionable, So I mean, we only have Sappho, I assume, as all poets, wanted her poems to come down whole, but they didn't. They were lost and really only recovered mostly in these shreds. So we have only fragments of her work that are left to us. And then I was reading, in this Facing Page translation, If Not Winter by Anne Carson. And so on top of that, I took little pieces of those fragments, and I did what some of the historical figures who are characters in my book did, which is to use them in my own ways. And I do think there are questions that could be raised about that, because you're seeing the allure of the fragment, this kind of romantic idea of, the fragment is just waiting for you to complete it, to finish it, to wrap your idea, your interpretation, the rest of your line around it. And the women like Natalie Barney, like Renée Vivienne, who were very invested in the poetry of Sappho, picked up both her poetry and her as a figure and reanimated her for their own purposes, what they wanted. And I think in some ways I did that not only with the fragments of Sappho, but also with the women I was writing about around the turn of the century who were doing that with Sappho as well. So there is something, about the way that I used fragments. They're not, I made choices about that.
Wonderful. It's very romantic, right?
Well, there's a danger, the allure and the danger of the fragment.
Well, let's shift gears into a slightly darker territory, and that is how I noticed in rereading the book even more so how much the tone shifts when you get to World War I, which of course is true in many historical accounts of Europe, right? The war is a dividing line. I was also thinking about how the tone in Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas gets much darker during the chapters about the war years. But I was also struck by how that shift in your narrative about the war also is coupled with this shift in how the figures in the book relate to Sappho.
Mhm.
The early parts of the book, the collective voice asserts, we were going to be Sappho. And you show how the study of Greek and other sort of imaginative realms like Natalie Barney's garden and
Performances in the garden.
all of those imaginative feats helped this collection of women to build new lives, to think about themselves differently, to create new identities for themselves. But then in the World War I section of the book, the voice shifts and says, now Sappho was going to become us. We were going to happen to Sappho, and Sappho would never be the same. And I wondered if you could talk about that shift in terms of the war, but also in terms of this change in relation to Sappho on the part of women in the 20th century.
Yeah, well, I think your reading is so insightful. Absolutely, I was very influenced by exactly as you said in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, how for Gertrude Stein, the war during the war after the war, it's never the golden time of omelets and art discussions that it was before. It's different. And so that, and the writings of Virginia Woolf as well, she was a pacifist, and the way that the war was seen at that time, it wasn't the First World War, it was the war, it was the Great War. So I'm trying to sort of understand that, I think, from their perspective, that's part of it. But as you said, also, I imagined it as, in the first part of this book, there's so much looking backwards, there's so much nostalgia, there's an idealizing of this idol that is imagined as an island of Sappho and poetry and what women could be if they were let be for a bit. And there's, I think there are some risks in that way of thinking. It can be quite colonialist, and it can be a way of freezing something in a hardened past of antiquity, where it can serve, I think, quite dark ends, like making that time in Greek history, let's say, serve as the prehistory of the British Empire or something. That's a problem. And so I imagined that at a certain time there would be a rupture in how useful it can be to look back and say, we just want to go back how it used to be and be nostalgic, and that there has to be an end to pure nostalgia before it becomes dangerous. And instead, I imagined my characters, the voice of the we, the sort of the chorus, saying at some point, we have to invent forms that fit the shape of our lives now. We can't always look backwards. We also have to make something that fits as we are becoming. And that form maybe hasn't been invented yet. It's part of our work to make new forms so that new experiences and ways of being have a form that they can flow into without being constrained into something that has already been hardened. And so I did think about that. I think it's also probably a very modernist concern to think, how do we get a literary form, an artistic form, to fit the time that is happening now, the experience, this newness. So I'm probably also prey to that concern.
Well, but they were obsessed with that, right? Stein's whole idea of contemporariness, and Woolf trying to ask for a new kind of fiction that,
yes,
a
new kind of biography. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was fascinating, that the relation to Sappho shifts in this historical shift as well. So thank you for talking about that. The book as a whole is quite inspiring and upbeat and optimistic about the creativity of women. And it ends the story you tell ends in 1928, which of course is a banner year for women's achievements. This is the year women gain equal franchise in England, the year that Virginia Woolf gave lectures to women university students that became a room of one's own, the year of the publication of Woolf's Orlando, and course, the year of publication of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, as well as many other texts by women writers. So this is a very triumphant year to end this alternative history, this alternative narrative that your book presents. But I think that as we glimpsed in many of the references to Sappho throughout the volume, the future isn't necessarily going to be all positive, even though there is this lineage of creativity that we can draw upon. And I'm a little bit reluctant to use the word villains, but I'm gonna use it anyway. And I kept noticing toward the end, some of the figures turned a little darker, turned a little bit more into villains, which we really didn't see in the beginning, except for the male figures who are oppressive. So one of the figures who becomes a little bit like a villain is Radcliffe Hall. And the objectionable qualities in your book include her politics and her aesthetic choices. So I wondered if you might speak a little bit about Radcliffe Hall and anything else you want to say about villains.
I could get in trouble for this. Well, one thing about stopping in 1928 actually is that many complicated things in the political choices made by some of these historical figures who were my characters happen afterwards. So I chose not to deal with many of those things. Natalie Barney and Gertrude Stein, I guess, among them. Sibilla Aleramo also, who was such an important figure early on in Italian feminism and Italian literature at the beginning of the century, I did mention this anyway, did end up signing her name to a fascist organization, association in Italy. So there are some dark things that happen even in the time I'm writing about. So Radcliffe Hall, so it's difficult to have a year in which the comparison is between Virginia Woolf and anyone else, I think, and that's my bias. And Radcliffe Hall, has been very important for many people, particularly for lesbians, for trans people. And I'm bisexual, so it could be that Radcliffe Hall is just maybe not my thing. And I do appreciate all of, there's a great analysis of The Well of Loneliness by Heather Love, who's thinking about the importance of in feeling backwards, about these kind of bad feelings, backwards feelings. And so I appreciate, there's a whole volume called Palatable Poison, which is taken from the review that the sort of famous bad review of The Well of Loneliness from 1928. So I very much appreciate all the scholarship about Radcliffe Hall. I appreciate that Radcliffe Hall has been important for people. Virginia Woolf in public defended Radcliffe Hall's right to write this book, Radcliffe Hall's, that no one should ever ban this book, that no one should tell Radcliffe Hall what to write. And then in private, Virginia Woolf said that it was, kind of a gloopy, melodramatic, self-serious, moralizing mess. And I'm hopelessly on the side of Virginia Woolf. And I find that if the comparison is between Virginia Woolf's Orlando, which is such an adventure in gender and sexuality, is so playful, is so, and it's not that Virginia Woolf couldn't be critiqued on political grounds, I think, particularly about class and race. But if the comparison is between the absolute doom that dogs the heels of all, queer or trans lives from the very beginning of The Well of Loneliness, even before Stephen Gordon is bred into the world of the manor, and Orlando, who's going to go off and have all these adventures and be a writer and fall in love and change gender and, amuse themselves. It's not a fair comparison, and I very much come down on the side of Orlando.
Me too.
I thought I'm going to get in trouble for this.
My favorite catty comment of Virginia Woolf is about The Well of Loneliness. I could not keep my eyes on the page, which I can't reveal to my students until they've actually read it. Otherwise, they won't read The Well of Loneliness.
Yeah, an important book, let's just say. The Well of Loneliness is an important book.
Yes, very, very important, but aesthetically with, one foot in the 19th century, not as not as modernist and innovative, and also, yeah, terribly gloomy.
And yeah, and bad class politics. Anyway, that's my bias showing.
But Hall also was another one of these figures who already kind of started out with conservative politics and moved toward fascism and became even a little bit more than a soft fascist, as she's been called sometimes.
Yes. Yes.
So yes, that's kind of why she becomes a villain. So one of the more inspiring figures who is definitely not a villain is Lina Poletti, and one of the reviewers of the book calls Poletti your great discovery. And she was certainly a revelation to me. I had never heard of Poletti. I don't know a lot about Italian politics or literature. So could you speak just a little bit about her? Because I bet some of the audience members have not heard of her either.
Yes, well, it's not you. I mean, almost no one has heard of Lina Poletti. And I see that as someone, you know, I one of my languages in graduate school was Italian. I took a seminar in 20th century Italian women literature. We read Sibilla Laramo. Nobody ever talked to me about Lina Poletti. So it's not you. It's it's the canon or the archive or history, or whatever. It's there's one book that's partly about her that's not been translated, by an Italian scholar called Alessandra Ceni. The book is called Gli Occhi Eroici. And there's some articles, there's like some of her letters have been published. There's one poem that survives. There's so little. And in fact, I learned last year, I can't remember, there's a website, an Italian website, that's a group of people, they say about themselves, a group of women authors committed to discovering forgotten women artists, deforming the canon. And Jessie Simonini wrote a beautiful article about Lina Poletti for this website as part of the process of recovering and recuperating and bringing into the light. So anyway, not knowing about Lina Poletti, I think, is the norm. And when I finally did discover her, which was, I think, much later than I should have, I really fell in love. I really wanted there to be more about her. I wanted to find things in the archives. I wanted there to be a history of her life, or an autobiography, or, I mean, anything, you know, and there wasn't. And I think in a way, the selfish part of this book is that I made what I wanted to have found about Lina Poletti. I wanted her to be celebrated. I wanted her to have not only her life, but a chorus who would want to write her life, and all of the circles around her of people she might have known, or who were in her time, or who were thinking about what she was thinking about. And, you know, so I made not only sort of a history for her out of this, what little there was, but also like a world that I would have wanted to give her. And for me, that world goes right up into our world and is quite contemporary. So in the end of this book, and also in the middle, I put in some things that are from a contemporary transfeminist group in Italy called Non Una di Meno, which is fighting for gender rights and reproductive justice, and against racism, and for an end to sexual violence. And I took some of their chants. So they're in the streets now saying these things, and I took some of those chants and made them in with the poems of Lina Poletti, because I think that she would be in the streets with us saying exactly these things that we're still saying, you know, that we're still fighting for many of the things that they were fighting for 100 years, which is part of my being furious and maybe poetic, but also just furious.
Well, one of the images that is attached to Poletti is this great image of her up on the crest of a wave, able to see the future, able to see where we need to go, but no one else behind her can see to the top. And that's just yet another one of those images that really holds the book together, and the voice, the kind of radical voice of Poletti holds the book together. But at the end, she, you know, I looked up the biography. We do know when she died, in the 70s, but in your narrative, she disappears, right? That she's hounded by the fascists and disappears. And so she almost becomes this Sappho-like figure, this almost mystical, radical woman who just is elsewhere. And I wonder if you wanted to speak to that or would just let that be.
I think your reading was quite beautiful. Yes. In historical, as far as we know, Lina Poletti died in a small town in Liguria in 1971. I would like that, just as you said, I would like that not to be the only history that there is. I would like to think, what is the spirit of Lina Poletti that stayed on with us? You know, in what ways can she, I don't know, maybe only for me, but maybe not only, you know, be inspiring, be part of other lineages of that are available to people to say, I am not the first, I am not the only. It is not only this time that we have begun having these fights, it is also coming down to me, and there are beacons before me, and I will maybe be a beacon for someone, and someone will come after me and be a beacon, you know, so that some of us are less alone. And I wanted that to be part of, anyway, it's part of how I imagine Lina Poletti, as you say, being on the crest of the wave, seeing ahead of what I can see, being with us still.
Beautiful. Well, let me ask one more question before we go to any questions from the audience. And that is just about the genre of the book, right? After Sappho is being marketed as a novel.
Yeah.
You already mentioned that it has a 17-page bibliography, which is not typical of fiction. So I wondered if you wanted to speak to that question of genre and, you know, just this vexed problem of categories. Some of the reviewers, I understand, I didn't read a lot of those comments, but I guess some people are questioning your use of the words of the writers without quotation marks. So you know, there's a lot of genre questions here, and I wondered if you wanted to speak about what you saw that you were doing and anything related to genre.
Yes, well, certainly when I used things, I mean, part of the reason that there's a 17-page bibliography, and not only that, if you're interested, there's also there's, I don't know how many, probably 20 pages of just straight bibliography online, which my editors, my wonderful editors, Ellie and Sam at Galley Baker, were like, okay, maybe not also the 20 pages of just bibliography. That let's put this online. So I did try to be, in that sense, ethical. When I borrowed something, when I borrowed a phrase, or I translated very closely, I said, this is where it's coming from, so that it wasn't just taking, it wasn't just, you know, appropriation, it was an acknowledgement. But the thing about the novel, yeah. So when I first wrote the manuscript, I didn't know what to call. I mean, I knew what it was called as a title from the beginning, but I didn't know how to describe it very well. And I had sort of got to this form by trying to imitate a form that Anne Carson uses that she calls short talks. And I just wanted to be able to write short talks like Anne Carson could. But sadly for me, I'm not a poet, and I'm also not Anne Carson, evidently. So I really failed.
You're a poet, but none of us is Anne Carson.
No, it was so sad for me in that moment when I thought, oh, this is not a short talk at all. But my failure to be able to write a short talk, I wrote this other form, and then I didn't know how to call this form because it was different. It was interlinked, and there were a lot of them, and anyway, and it was interwoven with these other, as you said, these quotes and excerpts and bits of things. And so I started trying to describe it by just like piling a lot of words together, like it's a kind of, you know, feminist queer collective portraiture, pseudo-biography, semi-historical, but not really, but also kind of hybrid genre experimental. And that was a disastrous pitch letter, I have to say. It's really totally
Publishers don't like that.
Yeah, well, I just didn't know how to explain. And part of when I was sending it out to presses, I was thinking, nobody's going to publish this, but they might say, we're not going to publish this because it's and then I would at least know what it was. But actually that didn't happen. People just said, no,
Hmm.
It was less informative. But when I sent it to Ellie and Sam at Gallybeggar, they wrote back to me and they said, I think we might like to publish your novel. And I thought, oh, look at that. It's one word. And also when I reflected on it, it's such a generous and expansive idea of what is a novel. I mean, coming from a press that also published, you know, Lucy Ellman's Ducks Newburyport. So a really, they have they're very broad-minded about what could go in the category of novel. But I didn't, they get credit for calling it a novel. I didn't know what to call it. And I feel, you know, sort of honored to be included in the category, but I wouldn't have claimed it for myself because I just didn't know exactly what to name the form, or whether there was already a name that I didn't know.
But you're comfortable with it. You're
Exactly. I feel
happy to be called and not, you know.
into the novel party, you know, even though maybe I didn't really get an invitation until Ellie and Sam. So yes, I feel honored.
You're making me think of the Russian critic Bakhtin, who, you know, privileges the novel form because it can include anything, right?
Yes,
It's
yes.
a
I think people feel more like Bakhtin, that it can be expanded, and some people are like, that's not really a novel. So, you know, it depends which side you come down on, perhaps.
Yes, wonderful. Well, thank you for that reflection. And let's see if we have some questions from the audience. I do think one of our wonderful Mechanics Institute folks is going to read some of them for us.
And actually, Loretta, and Selby, I'll ask our first question, something we were talking about before. You know, with the vignettes that you've created, I call them the characters in your book, but they're actually real historical people, women, live. But what you have such amazing floating connections between all of these personae, you know, whether it's Sarah Bernhardt, actress, Vita Sackville West, a writer, Romaine Brooks, a painter, Isadora Duncan, dancer, but somehow you found this connective tissue, or their meetings, or something that influenced one to the other. And it kind of gives us this like three-dimensional time, place, of all these different people that lived in the same time or not in the same time. So I wondered if you could talk about how you made those connections, where you found the connections, and also were the things that were surprising to you, that you discovered along the way, or shocking, or something that just opened up a whole relationship between two women.
Okay, yes. That's a lovely question. Well, as you said, you know, I mean, everyone who is a named character in this book is a real person. I suppose we could talk about whether Cassandra is a real person or not, but apart that, everyone is, and the chorus is my invention. It's a kind of amalgamation of identities. But other than that, you know, as you say, Gertrude Stein is very much a real person in her own right. So some of the suggestions came from the actual ways in which these circles overlapped, and that was not accidental. In particular, I mean, Gertrude Stein, but also Natalie Barney, maybe above all, made it her job to gather around her in her salon, and through, you know, her sort of various projects, circles of women who you know, then met each other and ate cucumber sandwiches together in her you know, in her salon, actually. So there was a way in which I didn't have to invent these things. They were orchestrated by the people themselves, and also, as you said, in more glancing ways. You know, not everybody came into the salon of Natalie Barney, but people read other people, or they crossed paths with, or they heard about, or they were thinking about the same kinds of questions at the same time, or they knew someone who knew someone. And so there were other less direct interconnections that caused these circles to overlap, I think. And then And then too, you know, today I was fortunate to have a talk with someone who works on Natalie Barney, who's called Suzette Robichon, who's here in Paris, and she, for example, has edited some of the letters of Natalie Barney with Liane de Pougy, and we were talking about how our notebooks, how the notebooks have constellations in them, like little drawings, like, and the constellations go off the page, and how at some point you have to figure out like how many stars can you cram into a page, and how to, you know, how to configure them, how to understand the constellation. It is very 3D. Anyway, we were laughing about how messy our notebooks get and how much they look alike. How, I mean, my handwriting is worse than Suzette's, but other than that, there's like, you know, these little sort of almost geodesic tessellations of names and figures together. So I think that was an attempt to keep track of that feeling of overlapping circles.
Thanks. Andy, do we have other questions in the Q&A that you'd like to read off?
Yes, and I do welcome all of our attendees to put any questions for Selby or Loretta in the Q&A. I do have a question here from one of our audience members for Selby that asks, what are the topics you're drawn to that you haven't had an opportunity to write about yet?
Oh wow, I could go on for another hour about this. I'm always falling in love with some new thing, and then it's another year of learning about things. I guess I don't know if this is a question about like what would I have put in the book but fell off the page of constellations, or whether it's like what am I into, what weird new thing am I into now? I'll try to answer briefly both of them. So one thing that I love that fell off the page of this book was a story about the actress Sarah Bernhardt, who lived in Paris, and at the time when she was 50, and she was very famous, height of her fame, and quite wealthy at that point, and had a very diva-like life. You know, she had a pet alligator she walked on the leash in the gardens of Paris, and she went out with a painter friend, to an island on the coast of Brittany one summer day, to the very north point of the island, and there was a ruined fort there, and she said, "I'll buy it," and she bought the fort. And all the island people on Belle-Île-en-Mer, is the island, were like, great, another diva who's like got a whim for the day. But every summer, for 29 summers, she went back to the summer house on Belle-Île, and she became very attached to the place. And one winter, when she was in Paris, there was a terrible storm in the sea around Belle-Île, and I think it's 1911, and the fisher people couldn't go out to sea. And there was a great worry that, you know, if you can't go to sea and you can't fish, your family can't eat. And they wrote to Sarah Bernhardt in Paris, and they said, can you please help us, because this is quite dire. And in Paris, she made a big gala. She made everyone come. She made everyone donate. She took all the money. She sent it back to Belle-Île. She bought a patch of land. She made a cooperative bakery for the fisher people. And no one starved in the winter in 1911 in the great storms because of the cooperative bakery of the fisher people of Sarah Bernhardt. And I think that's a beautiful story. Anyway, that fell off the page.
What strange curiosities do
what
you
am I
want
into?
to pursue
now? Well, one of the things I've got very into now is reading about microbenthic community, which is like the undersea fauna and flora. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know anything about the microbenthic community yet, but I'm learning a lot about macroalgae. And I have to say it's quite fascinating. Yeah, I am an amateur and an apprentice at this moment. I'm kind of like the intern of macroalgae, but I love learning about it, and I hope it will become something about the seafloor.
Terrific. As someone newly interested in lizards, I relate.
Oh, that. Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, lizards. Oh, maybe we should have an off-camera talk about this. I could be interested in lizards. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Loretta and Selby?
We do have one question from one of our audience members that just came in. And this is for Selby, and he says, I'd be interested to learn if she, as in Selby, has felt her studies of ancient Greek and Sappho have changed her in any way, such as the way that she looks at the world.
A lovely question. Well, you know, I mean, as someone who is sort of external to ancient Greek, it's not a language I've properly studied, so I'm really studying other people who have studied it in a way. I'm you know, learning at a secondhand distance. But I have loved learning about the various kinds of how can I say? So I did learn, you know, I've studied other case languages, like I studied German and Latin, and those have cases in them. So like ways of configuring relations between nouns, let's say. And when I was reading about how those cases work in Greek, for example, in the languages that I've studied, the genitive is mostly a thing of possession. So it's like how we use apostrophe S in English a lot, you know, like it belongs to someone, it's someone's house or whatever. But in Greek, from what I understand, you can also use it for all of these other things. It's not only about possession, it's not only about what belongs. And the word genitive, you know, is very connected to genealogy, to genital, to generation, to genesis. So some words that have their own very strong charges about what belongs and what is inherited and how the lines come down. And I really love the idea that you could have a genitive that you use for describing how things are remembered, so that it's a different idea than a possession. It's something that seems more like a tribute or a celebration or a way of cherishing. So maybe that's a romantic idea of what the genitive of remembering is, because I'm not a proper classicist. But I also think it's a beautiful way of looking at the world, to think, oh, there's a way of using a case that's about how to cherish something, so that you're not possessing it, but you're holding it. It's a kind of honor.
Beautiful.
If that's the end of our questions, then I want to thank author Selby Wynn Schwartz for her incredible novel, After Sappho. And thank you to Professor Loretta Stec for your wonderful questions and guiding us through this conversation. And I want to thank you both for such a celebratory and illuminating conversation about the lives and agency of women, past, present, and future. So once again, After Sappho, please pick up a book at your independent bookstore also, or read it here at the Mechanics Institute. And we're going to welcome you back for a next program. And we do hope to see both of you, Selby and Loretta, back again, hopefully in person at Mechanics Institute. And thank you to our audience as well. And join us again soon.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, and thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you.